Amen. Okay, we're in 2 Samuel chapter 3 primarily. We've got to do a little background work. Our wall map doesn't give us much to deal with there, so I got out my little atlas here. Right? Now, in chapter 2, we have a really interesting story of what happens in the Civil War. Remember, King Saul and 3 of his sons were killed in the battle at Mount Gilboa, right? And you're probably wondering where that is. Anybody familiar with Jezreel, the Jezreel Valley?
No, sir. I've heard it before, but I couldn't tell you where it's at.
Well, this map is a zoom in and shows us Mount Gilboa, but if you look at this map here, right, here's where the Philistines are, and so here's this battle. But see, Jezreel is way up here in this valley right here, and so Mount Gilboa is right here. So this is where the Philistines had come all the way up here and defeated Israel.
Drive through history, that's where I heard it.
Right? You know, so it almost severed Israel into two sections, right? Remember, David's down here, okay? Here's Hebron, south of Jerusalem, right? You know, which at the time was called Jebus, Jebus, right? And of course, Abner takes what's left of the northern army and they cross the Jordan River, and they're actually over here. Okay? So there's not much connection here, but with Isboshesh as the king here now, Abner appointed Saul's surviving son, right? And David down here, we end up with a civil war in Israel. Okay? And it is interesting, like even in our country, right? What's the most costly in human life war that the United States ever been involved with? The Civil War. Over 700,000 dead men in the Civil War. Because first off, you got to recognize we were both sides. Right? Civil wars are horrific. And what people can do to other people, even, especially if Jesus is not involved at all, but here we are in Israel, right? Both of them are supposed to be following Jehovah and the 10 Commandments. And they're killing each other. And this example that Abner and the northern, right, Isboshesh army meets up with Joab and David's army, right? And get into this at Gibeon, and they get into this, fight, and it all starts that Abner says that Joab, and this is in verse 14 of chapter 2, let the young men arise and hold a contest before us. So they each send 12 guys out to fight each other. Well, it takes no time at all for them to kill each other. Right? And that starts a big battle where both armies now are fighting, and Joab, David's army, is slaughtering Abner and Isboshesh army, right? And when you get down to the end of the deal, right, it says that Joab returned from following Abner, and when he had gathered all the people together, 19 of David's servants, besides Asahel, which is Joab's little brother who wanted to kill Abner and chased him until Abner turned around and killed him. Right? So 20 total. But the servants of David had struck down many of Benjamin and Abner's men, so that 360 men died. All because they're like, let's let the men have a contest. I mean, how silly is that? And once they start fighting, well, everybody wants to get involved. You know. And so 380 men died that day.
Not so unlike it is today.
Yeah, people are the same. You know, we haven't changed.
No.
You know, but so we've got all this going on. We got this civil war now. Do you think David is happy that he's got a civil war within his own country?
No.
I don't think so either. Right? Now, something interesting about this guy, Saul's youngest son, Ishbosheth, right? Do you know what it means?
I can't even say it.
Yeah. Man of disgrace.
Really?
Who would name your son man of disgrace when he's a baby? That doesn't make sense, does it?
Would have been he the one that had broken legs and
No, that's Jonathan's son. Meshibeleth, right? But this guy, man of disgrace. Now, what's interesting, in 1 Chronicles 8:33, we find out his name is man of master, Ishbaal. But when Samuel was written, Baal, the god Baal, right, had become a big problem. And so instead of using his real name, they used a name that described him, you know, in a different way, right? Man of disgrace. Interesting how that was handled, right? You know, now Abner, the head, the general, right, of Saul's army, who had been involved chasing David, right, was very loyal to Saul. He actually was Saul's cousin, right? He's still running the army, what's left of the army, after losing a big battle to the Philistines. And like I say, they retreated to the east side of the Jordan River. Okay? And it says in chapter 3, verse 1, there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, and David grew steadily stronger, but the house of Saul grew weaker continually. Right? And then he describes David's sons born to him at Hebron. So he ends up with 6 wives and 6 sons while he's at Hebron. Now, anybody know how long he's king of Judah at Hebron? 7 years. Right? I think it's actually 7 years, 6 months. Okay? Now, Abner, let's go ahead and start in verse 6. It came about while there was a war between the house of Saul and the house of David that Abner was making himself strong in the house of Saul, right? You know, he was the head of the army. The younger son, who is now quote-unquote king, is a real weak personality. He was never thought to be king. He's the 4th son, right? So Jonathan was groomed to be the next king. And Jonathan was a mighty warrior, right, in his own right. Remember? But yet he's now dead, and his 2 other brothers are dead, and so we're left with this guy. And so now Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, the daughter of Hiah. And Ishbosheth, man of disgrace, said to Abner, "Why have you gone into my father's concubine?" Now the first question is, why does he think Abner's gone into his father's concubine?
And what do you mean by gone into?
Took her to his bed. He jumped her bones, as we would
There you
say.
go.
Right?
Just put that in there like that, everybody would understand.
Yeah. But remember, but she is a concubine of the king. And in those days, one of the ways you would designate a right to the throne was to sleep with the wives and the concubines of the king, giving you a symbolism of being a king, right? So this Ishbosheth is now accusing Abner of doing that and seeking the throne. See, that's what he's saying. You're trying to take the throne away from me. Now it's Abner that made him king. Right? And has been defending him and keeping him alive, you know. So I don't know if it's a true story or not. It does say, right, that Abner was making himself strong, implying there's some truth to it. Okay? But Abner then was very angry over the words of Ishbosheth and said, am I a dog's head that belongs to Judah? Right? It says here, I've been defending you, taking care of you, right? Keeping you, I set you up as king, I'm keeping you as king. I've been with Saul, your father, all this time, right? I'm even his doggone cousin, right? And you are calling me a dirty dog, right? And a dog in those days was a scavenger, right? So this was a real insult, you know, to be called a dog, right? It says, today I show kindness to the house of Saul, your father, to his brothers and to his friends, and have not delivered you into the hands of David. And so I've been loyal. And you're accusing me of this, in spite of my loyalty. It says, and yet today you charge me with a guilt concerning the woman. So he's saying it's a false accusation. The Bible's not clear as to whether it's false or not. But either way, the net result is, Abner says, may God do so to Abner, and more also, if, as the Lord has sworn to David, I do not accomplish for him to transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul and to establish the throne of David over Israel and over Judah from Dan even to Beersheba. So Abner's been fighting against God because he knows that Samuel has appointed David as the new king. But he and Saul have been fighting against God all this time, keeping the throne in the tribe of Benjamin. Remember, these guys are Benjaminites. They wanted to keep the throne. So in spite of God's wishes, right, they're fighting against it for years now. And all of a sudden, one statement from the quote-unquote king causes Abner to completely flip. Now he's going to follow God. I don't think there was a real spiritual awakening. I think it was an ego thing. Here I've done all of this for you, and you show me no appreciation whatsoever, you know. And by the way, you're not even supposed to be king. You know, David's the anointed one, right? So it's time. Now, did God tell David he was going to be king? Yeah. Through Samuel. He told Samuel, this is the new king. My servant David. And what was David doing when he was anointed king?
Shepherd boy.
The youngest in the family, right? Shepherd boy in a small town. He was a nobody. He was an absolute nobody in society. But obviously not in God's eyes, right? So it is God's will that David become king. This little shepherd boy. Saul was the big guy. Remember, he was a head and shoulders taller than everybody else and the most handsome guy in the kingdom. And David is this little runny guy. So if it's God's will for David to become king, why do we have to have a civil war to make it happen? Why do we have to have all these dead people?
Rebelling against God.
Why is God's will so hard to accomplish sometimes?
I heard it stated one time on a preacher on the radio said something along the lines of, you need that in order for the moral good to make a greater impact. Something to that effect. You need more blood, more death, more sin in order to make the moral aspect greater. Something like that. Made sense when he said it, so don't listen too much to my. But I was sitting there going, well, that kind of makes sense, I guess.
Well, I think it comes down to, like Paul's saying, that sometimes we don't really want God's will.
Yeah.
Or people around us. David wanted it to happen,
Yeah.
but other people didn't want it to happen. And it became hard for David, right?
Well, it's a little bit like you're talking about Job being the oldest book of the Bible. Is, I personally like the result of Job's life. That how his riches were greater than what he had at the beginning. So I would love to have that, but I don't want to go through that other part.
Exactly, yeah.
And that's where, if I have to go through this deep valley, I'm not sure if I really want to do that. 'Cause
See, even now, since I started, it's been a couple of years since I started this, I keep thinking, when Christ died, and all the pain and suffering he went through, would I want to be doing the same thing? And so far, my answer's been no. What do you do?
And since you're a sinner, you can't even die for your own sin.
That's right.
Let alone somebody else's, right? It's interesting that because of sin in the world, right? And we all deal with it, we have this conflict against God's will. Sometimes it's internal battle, right?
Mhm.
We may know what God wants us to do, and yet we fight it. A lot of times we know what he wants to do in terms of the sin in our own life.
Mhm.
And we're like, but I like it.
It's a temporary satisfaction of it,
The problem is it's very temporary, but the consequences of it are not.
yes.
Right? So we've got all of this going on, but then when we're settled with it, David was settled with it, now you got to deal with all these other people who are interfering with what God's will is. And so you end up with this huge civil war. I don't know how many thousands of men died in the war. I mean, we know this one example, 380 died one day in that one battle. Right?
Yeah, those horrible dudes.
They've got all these neighbors that are wanting to kill them, and then they decide to kill each other. What's the logic to that?
I'm
They
not
weren't
sure
that
they
smart back
function
then.
on logic.
Yeah, I was going to say, when the ego gets in the way, all kinds of crazy things can happen, right? So, Abner, right, it's going to say, I'm going to transfer the kingdom to David. He could no longer answer Abner a word because Ishbosheth was afraid of him, which you would imagine, he's the general. Ishbosheth doesn't even have the army on his side. He can't even tell somebody to arrest him. When Solomon's brother decided he wanted to take one of the wives of of David as a wife, right? Solomon had him killed. So you're trying to take the kingdom? This is the second time you tried. So you're done. but he had control, right? Ishbosheth does not have control of the army. Abner does, right? So he can't say a word, and Abner sent messages to David in this place saying, whose is the land? The land of Israel belongs to who?
I wanna say the Jews,
Because,
they're
Not
God's
God's
chosen.
so who actually owns the land?
Oh, God,
God,
yeah.
right? But he's saying this is going to be your land, right? Make a covenant with me, and behold, my hand shall be with you, and to bring all Israel over to you. Now, David believed he could do this, right? He's in charge of the army. And in those days, if you had the army, you're the one that's actually in control, right? By the way, Leviticus 25:23 tells us that God owns all the land, right? And he said, good, I will make a covenant with you, but I demand one thing of you. Namely, you shall not see my face unless you first bring Michal, Saul's daughter, when you come to see me. Now, who's Michal?
That's,
So,
Besides Saul's daughter, she was David's first wife. Given to him because of what? He goes on to tell us, so David sent messengers to Ishbosheth. He didn't even send messengers then back with Abner. He sent them directly to Ishbosheth, who apparently had control over her, right? He says, give me my wife, Michal, to whom I was betrothed for, it says, 100 foreskins of the Philistines. And in 1 Samuel 18, see, Saul tried to get David killed and said, I'll give you her as a wife, but you got to go out and give me the foreskins of 100 Philistines. David came back with 200.
that's just kind of gross.
200 Philistines died so he could have Michal as a wife, right? But again, when David was at odds with Saul, Saul said, if she's a wife, that's giving him, again, access to the throne, right? He could be the next king. Well, I don't want him to be the next king, so I'm taking his wife and giving her to somebody else. Now that puts her in a position of adultery, doesn't it? So she's in a bad spot and has no control over the situation whatsoever. Okay? And Ishbosheth sent and took her from her husband, from Paltiel, we don't know anything about him, the son of Laish, but her husband went with her, weeping as he went, and followed her as far as Bahurim. Then Abner said to him, go, return. So he returned. I don't know if he loved her that much, or if he felt he was losing his position in society because he's no longer the husband of the daughter of the king, you know, da-da-da-da-da, right? But obviously it was a problem for him. And then Abner just said, go, and he said, okay. And he went back. Now Abner had consultation with the elders of Israel, saying, in times past you were seeking, right, for David to be the king over you. They all knew that Samuel had anointed David, right? So in times past you were saying David should be our king, right? Now then, do it. By the way, an elder in Israel traditionally would be 60 years old and wise and had risen to a level, you know, where they realized that he was an old wise man, you know, and was a leader in the tribe. Okay?
So where does that put us?
Well, 60 we've made. Wisdom, on the other hand, is a whole nother subject, right? So, but the Lord has spoken of David, saying, by the hand of my servant David, I will save my people Israel from all the hand of the Philistines and from the hand of their enemies. This is a quote from 1 Samuel 9, right? So they all knew that David was going to be their the guy who's going to save them from the Philistines and whatnot, right? And yet they've been fighting, arguing, debating, back and forth, etc. So he's saying, it's time, let's get this thing done, right? Now, why do you suppose David wanted Michal back as his wife? Did he love her?
Well, he had killed 200 Philistines for him.
For her, yeah. He did.
Well, from what I'm getting of this, that could have been just a pride or ego. The reason he wanted her back. So
Well, that's kind of the way I looked at it, but in reality, when you think about it again, remember her husband is losing his position.
Yeah.
See, with her as the wife, again, it establishes David as a king's successor. So he becomes one of Saul's successors, as the, quote, son-in-law of the former king, right? So it's kind of a passage kind of thing. But it also restores righteousness because she is his wife,
Okay.
right? So David probably had both of those things in mind,
Yeah.
and wanted her back. I mean, he already had 6 wives. Not like he needed another, right? And history tells us that she didn't have any children, so we don't know that he ever even slept with her. Now, maybe she was just barren, we don't know, but there's some reason why she didn't have children. So we don't know if David really cared for her. He just wanted, maybe just wanted that position, right?
So David was something of a jerk. I mean, because he's got 6 wives, counting on 7. Then he goes out and hits on Bathsheba later on. Is this the same David?
That's the same David.
And kills his best buddy. So I don't want to be friends with David.
And apparently Bathsheba ends up being his favorite wife
Yeah.
when it's all said and done, because whose son becomes the next king?
Yeah, Solomon.
Solomon, Bathsheba's son. Right? Anyway, Abner spoke in the hearing of Benjamin. And why Benjamin? Why do we keep hearing about Benjamin? Because Saul was a Benjaminite. Right? And in addition, Abner went to speak in the hearing of David in Hebron and all that seemed good to Israel and to the whole house of Benjamin. Right? Then Abner and 20 men with him came to David at Hebron, and David made a feast for Abner and the men who were with him. And he said, let's make a covenant in verse 21 with you, and that you may be king over all your soul desires. So David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. So the promise given to David through Samuel is finally being completed. Right? Now, unfortunately, Joab, whose little brother was killed by Abner in that battle that day, right? Azael chased him and chased him and chased him, and finally Abner says, look, dude, go back, right? And he wouldn't stop, and so Abner killed him. Well, Joab is holding Abner responsible for the death of his son, and he later murders Abner, which is not good when David's trying to be the king over all Israel, and the general of the northern army gets murdered by his general. Right? Talk about a political problem. That's in the rest of the chapter, right? And do we jump up to, I was trying to remember, I looked it up and I've already forgot. Yeah, chapter 5 is when he's actually anointed, made king over all Israel in chapter 5. So that's coming up. In the meantime, also, man of disgrace, Ishbosheth, right? He's murdered. The guys who murder him think again that they're going to go to David. David's going to be happy about it. And David's like, are you kidding me? And he has them killed, has their heads cut off.
This would be a great soap opera. It really would.
You can't match what's in there.
You can't write this stuff, man.
Right? So that sets the stage for David now as king over all united Israel. Right?
It's hard to imagine that it's okay to cut somebody's head off.
Really. But that's the case, that's what happened to them, and, it's just surprising that for God's will to be done, so much horrific things have to happen to accomplish the simple thing as David becoming king, right? Any other questions or comments on David's trials while he's in Hebron, waiting to be king of all Israel? All right.